Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football edition. And the sand continues to flow through that hourglass with just 2 weeks left of the college football regular season. Playoff picture clearing up a bit more. Conference championship races still in full pursuit, and we'll do our best to try and tie in some of those marquee matchups this weekend for all you guys and girls. I'm your host here, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And gentlemen, some big games on the docket this week with programs I don't think any of us anticipated covering deep into the month of November.
Yeah, I did not expect to be talking Army, before the Army-Navy game, and certainly didn't expect to be talking Indiana football at this point in the season.
Completely agree. And then there's some matchups where, had we zoomed out and looked at the forefront of the season, you're like, oh, we're definitely be talking about that game this week, and we just aren't. So I think we came up with some good games though that are fairly interesting to discuss, and should be a good week.
Yep, for sure. A couple of games that I don't think will surprise any of the listeners when you look at some of the marquee matchups and a couple others that I think are fascinating from a discussion standpoint and data as well. So with all of that being said, guys, Colorado on the road at Kansas. Of course, we know Kansas playing their home games these days at Arrowhead Stadium as the on-campus facility continues to go through massive renovations, and we have seen a battle in the market for this game. Colorado right now a 2.5-point road favorite in this spot, total of 59 for their trip into Kansas City. Kansas hosts Colorado after knocking off Big 12 contenders Iowa State and BYU in back-to-back weeks, defeating AP opponents in consecutive games played for the first time in program history, can become just the second team all-time to win 3 straight regular season games against AP-ranked opponents as an unranked team themselves, joining Arizona just 1 season ago. And Kansas looking to win 3 straight Big 12 games for the first time since 2007. Meanwhile, Colorado, full marks to what Deion Sanders and this group has been able to accomplish. They control their own destiny to reach the Big 12 championship game with remaining contests against Kansas on Saturday and a home date against Oklahoma State, which on paper doesn't look to provide that much in the way of resistance. But gentlemen, more than a deep dive on this game, I think narrative and some of the national storylines are much more important here. So I'll kind of throw an open-ended question out to you, Brad, and we can start there. From a number standpoint, we've seen Kansas as a bet-on team each of the last 2 weeks as short underdogs, both at home on the road. Colorado continues to be an ATS juggernaut. How have you gone about adjusting the numbers on these two teams? Because when you look at the win-loss record, it tells you one thing, but current form may tell you something very different.
Yeah, obviously Colorado's significant upgrade, 8 points since the start of the season, and I think that even the more pertinent story is since Coach Prime took the job, I've upgraded Colorado's power rating over that year and a half, almost 2 year period, 4 touchdowns. So he's certainly done a much better job than I can ever anticipate that what he's done. And obviously they're covering machine at this point with 8 straight covers. Kansas, despite a 4-6 record, I got their power rating right now as it currently stands flat since the start of the season. Obviously, there was a big downgrade, but I would argue that in the last month, the last 4 games, Kansas might be playing the best ball out of any team in the Big 12. Not saying much considering the Big 12, but certainly you got to respect starting with the Houston game. They blew them out. Houston's looked much better, at least the last 5-6 games for them, almost beating Kansas State on the road, leading that game, a majority of it. Obviously, beating Iowa State, beating BYU, although I wasn't wild with the BYU performance. I usually cry on Twitter about bad beats and whatnot. I thought we were pretty fortunate to at least come away with a win there. I thought there was a good chance.
Brad, you didn't have a pooch punt being the single most important play in an entire football game going our way on your bingo card for last Saturday?
I did not. So I was happy that they were able to hang on there. I will say with Colorado, despite the upgrades and all the publicity, Travis Hunter, now a Heisman lock. I mean, you could tell the media just, I knew the Heisman race was pretty much over the way they covered that game. I mean, they showed 2 highlights. They showed his fluke interception, and then they showed him running a touchdown with 2 minutes left when they're already up 3 touchdowns. And, oh, my God, Heisman winner. I mean, did anybody watch the game? Apparently not. Speaking of Colorado, I did find it interesting that they've only faced 3 teams in the top 40 of my power ratings so far. Lost to Nebraska, lost to Kansas State, needed a Hail Mary to beat Baylor. Kansas right now, at their current form, I have Kansas number 23. When you factor in home and away, might be their toughest opponent they've seen all season. So I'm anxious to see what that looks like playing somebody again because, boy, at the start of the season, you thought, oh, Colorado didn't get many breaks as far as the Big 12 schedule. They got to play Utah. They got to play Oklahoma State and all that. And the reality is they actually benefited not playing a BYU, benefited not playing in Arizona State. So, yeah, I think Colorado's overrated. I don't know if this is the week to really take advantage of it. There's certainly going to be a battle in the marketplace. Public's going to want to bet Colorado because of they've been a public team the last couple of years and they've covered 8 straight. I don't know if this is the week to find after back-to-back weeks. I don't know if this is the best week to back Kansas, if that makes sense, even though my power ratings are screaming it.
Payne, Brad mentions the battle in the market that we've seen around the key number of 3. We know Colorado is a team that leans into a guy that's going to be a top 5 overall pick. No, not Travis Hunter, but the man who actually makes this team go, and their starting quarterback in Shedeur Sanders. Their inability to run the football, could that pose some problems? Or, what's the most fascinating thing for you about this matchup from a numbers perspective?
I think Brad hit the game perfectly, and I'm going to try to have the conversation in a more PC manner as opposed to...
You can piss people off. It's okay.
What I really want to say, because Brad was going there, and I was hoping he was getting wound up enough to fully say kind of my thoughts as well. Listen, Prime's done a fantastic job overhauling this roster. It's not very difficult to improve from 1 win, though. And I think Brad hit it perfectly in that you have to upgrade Colorado, which is evident. But they've caught the perfect mix. They've upgraded, and they're now playing in the worst version of the Big 12 and human existence. And they've caught some fortune along the way, as Brad alluded to with the Hail Mary, or this is a 3-loss team. The only team they've played that's been ranked at the time, it was Kansas State in their own building, and they trailed by double digits multiple times.
And that's a data point that hasn't exactly held up over the last couple of weeks.
And that's my point, right? We all came into this season, if you found 10 on Utah and had the information that some quarterback stuff was awry, but that was supposed to be like the best team. Oklahoma State was supposed to be somewhat competent. Like, no one is very good, and Colorado has taken advantage of that. And so, again, it's been massively improved. Prime's done a fantastic job here, but I do wonder, not necessarily about just this season, but the future, right? I mean, it's annual mass exodus where 30 to 50 guys are leaving, and you're bringing in 30 to 50, and it just opens up a big ball of variance. And so, is this the peak? Is the peak right now in this moment? And you would have to think yes, because I doubt the Big 12 will be this horrific every single season. You're the only team in the country that's going to have 2 top 5 draft picks. You hit a Hail Mary, or otherwise you'd have 3 losses. My guess is you're going to end the season with 4 or 5. 4 at least, right? And you're not going to, if you get into the playoff, you're going to get buried. But
don't play spoiler now, Payne, and give away the goods.
The Travis Hunter situation is really interesting to me, and I know friend of the show Brady Quinn put him in the bucket of Shohei Ohtani. I mean, we see lots of high school players play 9 positions, and right now, as bad as college football is, I don't know what the difference is between high school football. But we don't see it at the professional level, right? This isn't going to, I think, happen at the professional level. To your point, last week we saw the narrative unfold. And it's like he's getting toasted for touchdowns. He's got about 40 yards receiving, and you luck box into an interception, and you have a meaningless rushing touchdown, and suddenly your odds go from about even to a massive favorite. It's just crazy to see legacy media on the sports side of things this go around.
Storyline
turn this thing into a monster, and it's just I'm left scratching my head sometimes at what I see. And it's not just taking shots at Travis Hunter, but it's like thinking logically. Sometimes we have everyone's like, this is a quarterback award. Yeah, it's a quarterback award because quarterbacks are the most valuable position on the field, and that's only grown as the sport passes the ball more. And so I look at this, and it's like, what is Colorado's record? And sometimes this is difficult to tell when you're comparing players from different teams. These two are on the same team. Colorado probably has one less win if Travis Hunter is around. Colorado might have one win if Shedeur Sanders is not there. So it's like we're voting for a kid who's not even the best player on his own team. Well,
I mean,
and
look, I'm with you. I get crushed when I tell people that he's not even the best receiver on his team. That's an honor that LeJonte West does not take.
He's not.
In terms of being that. But you guys are exactly right, and I think that's what's made the pricing and the battles that we see on these Colorado games so fascinating, and why Kansas has taken money at 3, but the Jayhawks secondary is going to have to step up compared to the effort that we saw overall from top to bottom last week against BYU. So one of the marquee games, didn't require a deep dive in terms of the X's and O's, but the other thing I'd like to say for Kansas, a veteran-laden group sitting at 4-6, who knows they have to win their final 2 remaining regular season games should they want to go bowling. So you have to imagine you get an all-in effort for Kansas. Is it good enough to get the outright win? That remains to be seen, but if Kansas doesn't come to play this Saturday, I can't imagine the regular season finale will be all that pretty for the Jayhawks, who dealt with injuries and inconsistency along with a lot of bad luck early in the year to put them behind the 8 ball. Gentlemen, SEC country, noon Eastern, Ole Miss, fresh off a bye, takes on the Florida Gators, who come into this game fresh off an upset win of Brad's favorite coach in all of college football, Brian Kelly. Ole Miss, a double-digit road favorite at the Swamp, total in the game 55.5. These two head coaches, high level of familiarity with one another. They were on the same staff at Alabama back in 2014 to 2016. Lane Kiffin, through some of his media availability early this week, spoke glowingly about his relationship with Billy Napier. So you like to see that level of mutual respect. Ole Miss, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, they come in well-rested off of their upset win against Georgia, in my opinion, and I think most people's very much in control of their own playoff destiny. Beat Florida, beat Mississippi State. They'll be included in that 12-team playoff. Meanwhile, for Florida, early on in the campaign, we knew that this schedule on paper was going to be one of the more difficult ones in the country. Florida has now put themselves in position to get that elusive Sticks win, whether it comes this week or it comes next week at the hands of the Florida State Seminoles to get bowl eligible. But Florida, in that win last week against LSU, ran just 43 plays offensively. Defense was out on the field for nearly 42 minutes in that contest. It shouldn't detract from what it means in a win-loss standpoint, but it could have long-term ramifications this Saturday. And Brad matched up from a defensive standpoint against an Ole Miss offense that's rested, wants to play with tempo, maybe most importantly, the healthiest it's been in weeks, getting Trey Harris back in the fold. Caden Lee saying the bye came at the perfect time for him to heal up. Doesn't seem to be a recipe made for success for the Gators defensively, knowing that Ole Miss can provide a hell of a lot more balance in the running and throwing variety than what LSU could do, knowing they had to drop back and throw early and often that allowed the Gators to tee off from a defensive line standpoint.
Yeah, no surprise here. Big edge to Ole Miss's offense here. Obviously, it's an offense that, went through a little bit of an inconsistent spell there, but got right against Arkansas, unfortunately, for a total play. And then, really an impressive, emphatic game against Georgia. Not overwhelming, but you're never going to be overwhelming against Georgia's defense. I did think it was interesting that, Dart, and when you look at the basic stats, I mean, number 2 in opponent adjusted EPA dropback, number 3 in QBR, number 1 in yards per attempt. but, gets banged up, and all of a sudden the offense actually looks like it's even more explosive with the backup in there. All of a sudden he magically goes to, I don't think he's going to play the rest of the game, to, oh my God, I'm going to get Wally pipped here, and I got to get back in this game against Georgia. I might lose my job. So I'd like to see a little bit more consistency out of him, not necessarily for this game, but if Ole Miss is going to, make a deep run into the playoffs, I need to see a little bit more. What I have seen from him specifically is, play action's been really good for Ole Miss this season. He's got the highest grade in the country in play action. He's got 600 more passing yards on play action than any other quarterback in the country. And the one thing that Trey Harris going out of the lineup did is it forced their offense to be a little bit more balanced, finding new weapons, whether it's Caden Lee, Watkins, the tight ends. So it doesn't have to be throw the ball down the field deep to Trey Harris all the time. But speaking of Harris, looks like he's going to be back in this game after when he went out of the lineup against LSU, he was leading the nation in receiving at that point. Another thing that's a little bit of a worry for me, at least not necessarily again for this game, but if you're thinking long-term for Ole Miss, the offensive line, and did enough against Georgia, but my goodness, in SEC play only averaging 3.4 yards per carry. Stack rank that nationally, that would rank 121st in the country. Henry Parrish out for the season. Can Bentley be that guy, 15, 20 carries a game? He's played a ton of football. I felt like I've watched him forever. Back to his SMU days during the COVID season where I was impressed with him. But I have more concerns maybe long-term for Ole Miss than I do for this game, because obviously you hit the nail on the head, Todd. You talked about Ole Miss wanting to play with tempo, getting healthier against a Florida defense that, basic stats look okay last week. They only gave up 16 points, but the reality was they were on the field for 42 minutes. They were on the field for 93 plays, and I'll tell you who was on the field for 93 plays. How about all four guys in the secondary, both starting cornerbacks, both starting safeties, on every single defensive snap last week, mainly because they needed them because they were so banged up in the secondary. I was a little surprised Florida kept taking money in that game with their injury report. Right now, as we stand on Wednesday morning, it looks like a lot of those guys are still questionable in that Florida defense. And while the defense is a little bit better than last year, it's still, below par. This is a Florida defense number 99 in the country in defensive success rate. They struggle in early downs. Ole Miss is really good in early downs, so I expect Ole Miss to be in third and manageable consistently, even if they get to third down. I think this is going to be a layup on first and second down. There's some guys that I like on the edge, Sapp and Gums, but other than that, when they've had to step up against the best offenses in the country that they've faced, Miami torched them, Texas torched them. I think Ole Miss torches them. I'm part of the Ole Miss money already this week.
It makes a world of sense looking at the Rebels in a good spot here to keep things well within their grasp, knowing what lies ahead of them for two games. And Payne on the other side of the ball for Florida. Look, credit to DJ Lagway coming back from that hamstring injury. But the one thing that was evident, if you watch that game against LSU, he clearly wasn't as mobile as we've grown accustomed to. They didn't have one attempted rushing play whatsoever, but the Florida offense benefits with Lagway out there, his ability to throw the deep ball. 18.8 yards per completion is the second in FBS with a minimum of 50 passing attempts. We saw the difference that Elijah Badger can make. You would think that LSU would figure out to cover the deep ball at some point during the game, but that may have been lost on their defensive game plan. And we're seeing a little bit of a youth movement with Florida in the backfield running the football. But in steps an Ole Miss team whose defensive strength is along the defensive line. You have a prominent Florida transfer who's spoken about the importance of this game and kind of a homecoming of sorts. If Ole Miss can make Florida one-dimensional and Lagway finds himself running for his life, I can't imagine it's going to be that much easier for Florida offensively against the Rebels' defense than the case Brad laid out for Ole Miss's offense having a massive edge against the Gators stop unit.
Yeah. Now, listen, we don't want to poo-poo the whole thing. I think this is maybe the one podcast that's liked Billy Napier more than
I think we might be the only one.
The national narrative.
We might be the only one out there. Even the Florida podcasts that are built in and around the program don't like Billy.
Certainly the Gators' schedule hasn't been as difficult as we projected before the season, right? Historically tough was what we thought. It's been easier than that, but it's also the case for virtually every team in the country because the sport is way down, and we still may get mud on our face there if Florida State can't do the Lord's work. But I say that to say this. I believe Florida's probably at the peak of their 2024 market, and it's because of the timing of their wins. I was going through their schedule yesterday, and it's like you beat UCF, but that's at the very bottom of UCF's market this season. You beat LSU last week. To me, they're far closer to the floor of their market than the ceiling right now, and I think that's why the price came a little short at open here on Ole Miss. There's also two versions of the swamp that you have to price differently. You get noon kickoff swamp, which is this. It's not nearly the same as 7:30 kickoff swamp. And then you dive into the actual matchup on this side of the ball, and Todd, you were basically hinting at it along the way. We've seen good scripts from Napier, so that's still not out of the range of possibility in this spot. DJ Lagway obviously has a bright future, but this is, to me, just kind of a tough spot for a young kid that's not close to being polished, and to your point, I think isn't 100% healthy. And there's a few things that are glaring to me. Is Florida's offense and Lagway are certainly stepping up in class, and I think LSU's defense has improved some, but it's still outside the top 100 in explosiveness allowed. So it wasn't overly shocking that Lagway was able to hit some deep shots there. And so when I kind of focus on Lagway's performance last week, what I saw was a Gators offense that continues to be a little bit feast or famine. So on throws behind the line of scrimmage, on throws that were short and intermediate against the bad LSU pass defense that's outside the top 100, Lagway was 10 for 22 with a passer rating in the 60s and 3 turnover-worthy plays. He spammed the explosives again, 3 for 4 on deep shots, 20-plus yards downfield with a touchdown. I don't know if Lagway's going to have time to hunt the deep ball here. And I know Florida's offensive line is, I think, somewhat improved, but they're still outside our top 80 in a lot of key metrics. Ole Miss, number 1 in the country in pressure rate, top 10 in the country in defensive line havoc created, sacks, passing down sack rate. Lagway has not been good under pressure. I just don't envision him having a complementary ground game to ease some of the weight that's going to be on his shoulders. Florida hasn't gotten a ton of push either in the ground game, outside our top 70 in schedule adjusted line yards created. Ole Miss, again, top 15 in defensive line yards allowed. So I looked at this game and kind of said to myself, price is short if you want to back Florida. Matchup isn't great, stepping up in class. And I think sometimes when you're looking to back some of these dogs at home, you're looking for a perfect spot, right? Situation, environment. Talked a second ago about the environment, right? It's not the night swamp, but it's kind of a sleepy noon kickoff. Ole Miss had half a week or more to kind of celebrate the Georgia win and still get back to work and refocus. And this isn't like week 4 where Ole Miss can give one away. It's the exact opposite. The Georgia win becomes meaningless if the Rebels can't win the next 2 weeks. So I don't know if you get that non-zero chance of Ole Miss being sleepy off a big win. I just don't see that being the case here, where you might have it in another situation at a different juncture in the season.
No, it makes a world of sense, but I will provide a little bit of silver lining for Florida fans who think we're shitting on their team as we break this game down. I'll give credit to the Gators for what they've been able to do this season. They've now won 3 straight games this season when listed as a home underdog. They've won all of those games by double digits. I'm not suggesting that that's even close to being remotely on the table this week, but it's the most consecutive wins by 10-plus points as a home underdog since FAU did it back in 2008 to 2010. Florida accomplished that against UCF, Kentucky, and LSU. So credit to the Gators for that.
The other thing that we give them credit for, and you have to actually watch some of these games, is the last couple years when Billy Napier has been on his deathbed, so to speak, right? Everyone wants him out. And I think it's really prevalent now when we saw a lot of NFL teams this past weekend, specifically, the Jets 2 weeks ago, the Browns defense this week, even some of these teams in college football. There hasn't been any quit.
Great
out of Florida. Those guys play fucking hard.
They do.
For Billy Napier. So kudos to him for that when the deck has been stacked against him for sure.
Yep, makes a world of sense. So a fascinating game to kick things off early on Saturday from Gainesville. Big Ten country, gents. Penn State takes on Minnesota, 3:30 Eastern time, Saturday afternoon. And Penn State, when you look at the college football playoff rankings, very much in control of their own destiny as well. Win this week, win the regular season finale, James Franklin will finally be able to play a meaningful postseason game during the month of December. Penn State, a double-digit favorite in this spot. 11.5 will kind of call the consensus here. Total on the game, 45. First time, though, for Penn State playing back-to-back road games without a bye week since 2021. Penn State seeks its third straight 10-win season for the first time since the early 80s, looking for their 30th straight win versus teams other than Ohio State and Michigan. The win over the Boilermakers last week was the largest win, most points, and most yards in a conference game this season. For Penn State, most yards per play at 8.84 in any conference game since at least 2000. Minnesota, on the flip side, enter off a loss to Rutgers, having an extra week to prepare for this game. Under P.J. Fleck, this number kind of stood out to me. 19-4. With 7+ days between games under Fleck, 32-31, so basically a 500 team in all other games. Second best record with 7+ days between games in the FBS since 2017. The only program better in that department has been Georgia. Minnesota, well, they've at least been able to throw a wrench into Penn State's plans previously. Past 2 wins versus AP top 5 teams, both coming at home against Penn State in 1999 and 2019. Minnesota, 3-0 against the number of the last 3 games they've taken on a top 5 ranked Penn State team. And Brad, part of what we've seen from the Gophers this year is a little bit more balance. They come in off a loss against Rutgers where they broke tendency. Most passing attempts of 45 and fewest rushing attempts at just 19 in any game since P.J. Fleck took over in the Twin Cities. Max Brosmer's not going to wow you with what he can do in the passing game, but at least provides a legitimate threat there with his number 1 receiver, Daniel Jackson. But in a game like this, with a double-digit underdog, if Minnesota is going to have a puncher's chance, this is where Darius Taylor has to get on track. They need more push from the offensive line against the Penn State defense that's giving up the 6th fewest points per game in the FBS this season, and the only team to rank top 10 in the FBS in points per game allowed over each of the last 4 seasons. What gives with Penn State's stop unit against the Minnesota offense that has to create some balance, but hope they can get push in the ground game?
Yeah, edge clearly here to Penn State. You hit on some of it. I mean, if you haven't watched Minnesota football this season, I'm sure a lot haven't. It's not like we're breaking down the Gophers each week, but completely different style, stylistically. Just basically from a run-pass mix, I mean, Minnesota felt almost like an option team for a couple years. I mean, in 2021, they were 70% run, 22, 67%. Last year, 62% still run. This year, 53% pass of all their plays on offense. 53% pass. So dynamic change. They talked all offseason. They like the kid from New Hampshire, the Brosmer, the transfer quarterback. I mean, he's played all right. 67%, 14-4 ratio. It's certainly better than what they've had in recent years, but still not going to overwhelm you with arm talent. Decent decision making. You mentioned the last time we saw Minnesota 2 weeks ago, they threw 45 times against Rutgers, tied for the most in any Minnesota game in the last 14 years for them. But even though they rely more on the pass than recent memory, they're still not an explosive offense. They're still number 100 in the country in yards per play. Not going to overwhelm you. I mean, total offense 113. They're just not going to overwhelm you in the pass game or certainly the run game compared to past years. Because the thing that I worry here is, and maybe would have been, a little bit more advantageous, or at least give me more inclination to want to bet Minnesota the double-digit underdog here, is the run game just hasn't been there. I like Darius Taylor as a running back, but, I mean, the Gophers are only averaging 105 rushing yards per game. That's the worst for them in 15 years. Now, in a couple of games when they needed to lean on it late in games against USC and Illinois, they were able to do that, but I'm here to tell you those fronts are not the Penn State front. And, in fact, the Minnesota offensive line has struggled against some talented fronts. You look at North Carolina, they don't play like it, but they still have some high 4-star kids on that defensive line. Gave up 5 sacks in the opener. Against Michigan, even though Minnesota came back in that game, they still had trouble with that front. They gave up 5 sacks. So, if you can't establish a run, and you're talking about the Penn State pass rush teeing off on Brosmer, I don't know if that's necessarily a good look. With that being said, I do want to mention this about Penn State's defense, even though, the numbers are going to look good, 7th in yards per play, 4th in total defense, top 10 in success rate. I still think this Penn State defense is overrated. I just go back to USC moved on them consistently. Ohio State had a banged-up offensive line, pushed them around that final 5-6 minutes that drive, all runs. Ohio State ran it right at them. So I think moving forward, when Penn State gets in the playoffs, I'm still in this thought process that Penn State's overrated. I just don't think for this particular week, Minnesota, the way they're built in 2024, is going to fully take advantage of some of these weaknesses on this Nittany Lion defense.
Payne, if Minnesota's got a puncher's chance here to keep this game competitive, does their defense have the ability to hold up against the Penn State offense that leads the Big Ten in total offense at 454 yards per game? Third down offensive efficiency, they're top 5 in the country at 7.1 yards per play. It's the most yards per play we've seen from a Penn State offense since at least 2000, so credit to Andy Kotelnicki and what he's been able to do. And Drew Aller comes in brimming with confidence, given his performance against Purdue. Gophers defense against Penn State offensively. Can the Gophers do enough to provide a speed bump in what at least projects on the surface to be a lower scoring football game?
A little bit better defense than Purdue's, but
doesn't take much to be better than the Boilers on that side of the ball.
There's some things here, right? Senior day for the Gophers. You have 2 weeks to prepare for Penn State, and you mentioned some of those ATS trends there. And listening to PJ Fleck, it sounds like the extra time was mostly used on Penn State, whereas Minnesota's first bye week last month, the vast majority of the staff was on the road recruiting. This bye week was used differently, so let's see if that helps. Minnesota, to me, has to negate Penn State from getting out fast and then leaning on them the rest of the way. You can't be emotional on senior day and effectively not show up for the first quarter. You have to get up to game speed quickly off the bye because Minnesota's style of play isn't overly conducive to chasing, right? Minnesota wants to bleed the clock on offense, run the ball, punt, ugly this thing up, play mistake-free football, don't put their defense in compromising positions, and then see where the chips lie late. That's basically what they've done in some of these games where they step up in class. I would envision Corey Heatherman, the defensive coordinator, who we know is aggressive. He's probably going to have to load the box here to help the run defense, force Penn State's receivers to win one-on-one with Drew Aller being, accurate. I think you take your chances with that. Penn State's offensive line has been better run blockers than pass protectors, top 20 in the country in line yards created, top 10 in rushing success rate, and that's with Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton both battling through some things at different parts of this season. Minnesota's D-line has been pushed around at times. Usually it happens a little bit later in the game when they wear down, outside the top 65 in defensive line yards allowed. But because Heatherman likes to be aggressive, you look at the rushing success rate and numbers. Minnesota, they're a little bit better in terms of down-to-down run defense than the defensive line yards would indicate. So that's something maybe they'll have a little bit better of a chance to stop Penn State's ground game. Minnesota did some self-scouting during the bye week. That was one of the big talking points. PJ Flex mentioned tackling all week. That's going to be key here because one thing Andy Kotelnicki does really, really well is create space for his offense. You have to be really good tackling in space. The Gophers have graded out 89th in the country in tackling, over 100 missed tackles this season. Again, it's been a point of emphasis for Minnesota during the bye. Let's see if that gets cleaned up. But I think, overarching here for Minnesota to have a chance, they have to get Drew Aller into passing down situations where you kind of take a little bit of the disguise element away from Andy Kotelnicki, right? Basically, when you're sitting in standard downs, he gives Drew Aller the answers to the test. And so when you're kind of forced to throw the ball in known passing situations and your receiver group of Wallace and Clifford and Evans and Fleming are averaging less than 1.8 yards per route run as a foursome, it becomes a little bit more difficult for Penn State's offense. We've seen the depth of target for Drew Aller once he moved in conference dip a little bit. It even dipped last week. It's a group that's outside the top 60 in passing down success rates. So you got to get Allure in that receiver group in uncomfortable situations. And to do that, Minnesota has to stop the run on early downs.
One final thing, guys, when you look at the number where it currently sits in no man's land, do we think it comes down to 11? We think it ticks up to 13? Just kind of curious to get your guys' take on what you're reading from a market tea leaf standpoint.
It's a good question, and I'm not afraid to admit I don't have a good read on this one where it goes. My power rating is like right on it. I got 11.8, so maybe we don't see much movement. I'll defer to Payne there.
Yeah, I was came into this one maybe a little interested in Minnesota because I just haven't been as high on Penn State as the market, and I don't necessarily know where this goes, but it was maybe my understanding if it got to 13, there would be a buy in the market here on Minnesota.
Makes a world of sense. An interesting game, and appears at least on the surface to maybe be Penn State's biggest landmine remaining between them and an 11-1 regular season, which should be good enough on paper to get them into a 12-team college football playoff. Want to encourage all of you, our loyal listeners, to follow our team of experts and analysts on this very fine show on social media. At BradPower7 is where you can find BP. At Payne Insider, where you can find Payne, and I'm Todd Fuhrman. Most importantly, as always, be sure to follow the podcast, though, at Bet the Board Pod. And gentlemen, we mentioned at the top of the show there were programs we didn't anticipate talking about being in marquee games this late in the season, and I think this probably becomes the one that nobody in the college football world circled for late November for Big Ten supremacy. It's Ohio State playing host to Indiana. The Buckeyes, a 12.5 to 13.5 point favorite, depending on where you shop, as they'll welcome in the Hoosiers. Total on the game, 52 more or less painted across the board, and it's a meeting between Ohio State's number 1 scoring defense in the FBS and Indiana's number 2 scoring offense in the FBS. Meeting between 2 of the top 3 quarterbacks in the FBS in passing efficiency, and Curtis Rourke at 182.7 and Will Howard at 181.9. As far as where these teams have gone about building their rosters, this I found to be pretty fascinating. You look at the average star rating for the players on these two teams coming out of high school. Indiana, 2.3 for their starters. Ohio State, 4.1. Average national ranking for a lot of their players. Indiana, 1,208. Ohio State, 198. Indiana has 6 starters that weren't ranked by any recruiting service coming into college. Ohio State has 6 players who are ranked number 1 at their position coming out of high school. Indiana, we know they control their own destiny to reach the first Big Ten championship game in program history. It's already been the first 10-win season in program history. The only FBS team in the past 50 years to start 10-0 after winning 9 or fewer games over the previous season. Kurt Cignetti has done this at multiple stops. Ohio State, on the flip side, seeking its second top 5 win this season. Ryan Day came into the year 2-5 versus AP top 5 teams as Ohio State's head coach. Meanwhile, the Buckeyes, 29 straight meetings versus Indiana that they have come away victorious. Their last loss back in 1988. Ryan Day, average margin of victory against these Hoosiers, 31.4 points per game. But this will mark the shortest favorite Ohio State has been versus Indiana since September 14th, 2019, when they closed -18. Indiana, 4th top 5 team to be a double-digit underdog in the regular season in the last 10 years. Ohio State, meanwhile, 0-7 against the number as a home favorite versus top 5 teams since 2000. So, gentlemen, I lay all of that out as we'll break this down from an X's and O's standpoint. Brad, Indiana offensively, extra week to prepare. Coming into this matchup with what Payne has called earlier in the season, and not meant as a sign of disrespect, a G5 All-Star team that has gelled under Cignetti's leadership, and Curtis Rourke has been their key pivot with receivers that may actually have favorable matchups against an Ohio State secondary that has been vulnerable to the explosive play for stretches so far this season.
Yeah, I'm still giving the edge to Ohio State's defense here, but the question is, how big is that edge? Is it a slight one? Could it be massive? And boy, there's maybe some more questions than answers, even though we're talking about week 13 of the season here. I mean, statistically, you gotta like Indiana's offense. Number 1 in offensive success rate, number 3 in offensive EPA, number 2 in scoring. The problem is, and I know people are gonna say recency bias. The problem is they haven't faced that tough of a schedule, to say the least, and that's putting it mildly. The most talented defense they have seen this year has been Michigan. A Michigan defense that, even though they're not well coached and even though statistically aren't dominant, still has 3 or 4 guys that will be taken in the first 2 rounds of next year's NFL draft. And the reality is Indiana had 246 yards, 230 yards below their season average coming into that game. Couldn't run the football, only 40 yards on the ground. They allowed 4 sacks. Previous to that, they had allowed 7 in the previous 9 games total. So in my opinion, they played really tight in the second half of that game. Maybe the pressure of being 9-0, playing, it's almost like a helmet game. You're playing Michigan on another side. They were conservative, I thought, for the first time this year in a game. Tight in the fact that, Surratt, their best wide receiver, had a couple of key drops that could have extended the drive and maybe even put the game away earlier than expected in that game. So I'm anxious to see how they handle the pressure of this one, especially against a very talented Ohio State defense. Curtis Rourke has been everything they could ask for and then some. He's number 3 in opponent adjusted EPA, number 2 in QBR, number 2 in yards per attempt on the season. Obviously, he had the hand injury, has looked okay since. They had the big game against Michigan State and struggled a little bit against Michigan. They got a lot of capable weapons. They're very balanced. You mentioned, I thought the key word being group of 5 all-star team. Surratt come over from JMU. Cooper, another wide receiver, 22 yards per catch. Ellison and Lawson at running backs combined for 1,200 yards. So, there's a lot of pieces to work with. And you mentioned it. There's going to be some opportunities to throw the ball deep and attack this Ohio State defensive secondary that, it's tough getting the Oregon game out of your mind. When Oregon went up and down the field on them, even more so than the final, in my opinion. So there's a pathway. But the reality is, this is an Ohio State defense just as talented as Michigan, better coached, number 2 in EPA, number 4 in success rate. I'm starting to like a little bit more what I'm seeing. Sonny Styles has impressed me in the last few weeks. Cody Simon's playing well. Caleb Downs obviously might be the most talented safety in the country. Lathan Ransom's graded out as the highest graded safety in the country. Sawyer's getting pressure. He's not going to be a top 10 pick, but he's getting productive. JTT's got 5 sacks. I just think they're going to overwhelm this Indiana offense that, I'm going to use to. Now, I know there's 10 data points, but maybe I'm succumbing to the most recent one, and to me the most pertinent one, that and them against Michigan. I think we see more Indiana's offense against Michigan than we do the other 9 games.
Brad, before we go to the other side of the ball, one final question I have for you. Do we have to tell Denzel Burke's family to avoid your Twitter feed on Saturday so he doesn't draw the ire about how much money he's giving away on a game-by-game basis given his performance this year compared to last?
I was really tough on him on the Oregon game. Might have been because I was heavily involved on the game, which, I'm involved this week, but not as heavily as I was at that game. So, no, I don't expect to be as harsh, but we'll see. And, one big play early, I can get going. I'm pretty hot-headed.
That's how I would say. We get you riled up early on a Saturday morning out here on the West Coast. Payne, Ohio State offensively, they were dealt a major blow along the offensive line that came out yesterday, lose their starting center in Seth McLaughlin for an offensive line that I know you had.
You weren't supposed to say anything.
Well, it's public now, so I can share the information. But it was a group that you had questions about all season long. We've talked about Ohio State, kind of reconfiguring the offensive line, especially at the tackle position on the left side. The other thing for Ohio State, slow start's been a legitimate concern. The Buckeyes have scored more than 7 points just once in the first quarter all season, and that came against lowly Western Michigan way back when in September in the non-conference portion of the schedule. Will Howard checking the boxes for what you want a game manager to do, given the elite talent he's surrounded by, and the receiver position has been a wealth of riches. The ground game has more or less been hit or miss with Quinshon Judkins, who did go for multiple touchdowns last week. But much like Indiana and the step up in class that their offense has against the Buckeyes defense, the same case can be made about a Hoosiers defense that takes on a Buckeyes offense with difference makers, space creators all over for an Indiana team that hasn't allowed more than 28 points in a game this season against an Ohio State offense that scored 30-plus in 8 of 10 games already in the 2024 campaign.
This one is – we get a couple of these matchups a year where there's just staunch difference of opinions based upon schedule, and it's difficult because Kirk Cignetti's won at virtually every stop, and he's come out of the gate on fire here. And to me, this hasn't been much of a fluke, especially on offense. Indiana has dominated its opponents for the most part, and I like Cignetti, right? It's like this great mixture of business-like confidence that borders on maybe cockiness, and there's no doubt off the bye, right? He's going to throw the kitchen sink at Ohio State's defense. In terms of the Hoosiers' defense, however, I'm with Brad. It's like it's tough to gauge. I think even more so on this side of the ball after 10 data points than maybe the offensive side of the ball, because you do have that question against Michigan's defense and what the Hoosier offense did. I have more questions on this side. I mean, Indiana has not faced a living, breathing soul on offense. Not one offense with a pulse. If you look at this, Indiana's defense has faced 7 offenses we have ranked outside our top 100 in schedule-adjusted efficiency. If you threw...
That's not good. By the way, for those scoring at home, that's not good.
If you threw all 10 offenses on the Hoosier schedule into a bucket, it would be like Indiana facing the 111th ranked offense every single week. So this is a monster step up in class for the Hoosiers defense. Monster step up in environment. Right? I mean, Indiana's only played 3 true road games, and they're laughable. Right? It's at UCLA. Nobody shows up to those games. It's at Northwestern.
How dare
the women's field hockey and men's lacrosse stadium.
Beautifully constructed on the banks of Lake Michigan.
It's at Michigan State. So, I mean, like, they haven't even been in, like, this raucous environment either. At the same time, they're stepping up in class. Specific to the matchup, the one that truly matters, that dictates, I think, not just I think has a massive hand in the game's entirety is up front. And maybe Indiana's saving grace and only hope is that Ohio State's offensive line has been the point of contention all season. It's the biggest question mark in the Buckeyes' ability to get over the hump and win a national title. It's become a bigger question mark over the last month. You have the starting left tackle, Josh Simmons, tearing his knee up in the first half of the Oregon game. He was easily Ohio State's best piece, 0.01% pressure rate allowed through the first 6 games. And then the news got worse, which you mentioned at the top, was you got Alabama's transfer center, Seth McLaughlin, tearing his Achilles during Tuesday's practice. He has been good as both a run and pass protector. He is, I know he caught a lot of shit last season at Alabama because maybe he was a little undersized and he was, getting beat up in the Michigan game, but he has been a saving grace for Ohio State's offense. He's also making all the calls at the line of scrimmage for Will Howard. So this was a thin group up front for Ohio State, and I think if you had to pick 2 guys at the beginning of the season that the Buckeyes couldn't afford to lose, it would be Simmons and McLaughlin. Indiana's defensive line has lived in the backfield this season. Even once you adjust for the poor schedule, it's still top 20 and defensive line havoc created, tackles for loss, defensive line yards allowed, pressure, passing down, sack rate, you name it. And they're led by Kamara off the edge, 17% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Carr and Carpenter chip in as well. Now, Will Howard does a very good job getting the ball out of his hands on time. He's only been pressured on 23% of dropbacks because of that. But when he does see pressure, nearly a 5% turnover-worthy play rate. So Indiana has to force a turnover or 2 to stay in this game. Something has to give on the ground as well. Ohio State wants to run the ball. That's been basically the script. That's been basically the game plan. That's why they went out and paid Quishon Judkins to add him to Travion Henderson. As a duo, 22% of their runs have gone for 10-plus yards, 27% forced missed tackle rate. Ohio State's top 10 in the country in both rushing success rate and explosive run rate. It's just a dynamic combination that Indiana hasn't faced. If you look at the schedule, again, the only running back kind of in the conversation of Ohio State's that Indiana's faced might be Jonah Coleman. He ran for more than 100 yards and 4.5 yards after first contact against Indiana's defense. You had Roman Hemby hit the 75-yard explosive. I think we'll know pretty early if Indiana's front can take advantage of the injuries for Ohio State's offensive line. To me, again, biggest matchup in this game aside from Indiana's passing offense. Ohio State has been the sharp side early in the week, right? Those positions came in, though, before the McLaughlin injury at better prices. the premise is very much Indiana's poor schedule, and the one time they've faced a somewhat competent defense, they struggled at home against Michigan. So kind of a tough game for me here. It's one of those where you're kind of going in, maybe as crazy as it sounds this far in the season, you're going in a little bit blind almost, just because we don't know what this Indiana defense is based upon just playing absolutely nobody.
Brad, I know Payne despises questions like this because he says they're more like sports talk radio, so I'm going to come to you for it instead so we don't have to see the disgust on his face.
He was a program director, he told me.
Yeah, well, that's why.
For radio. So Brad doesn't
That's why I'm coming to BP. He's a college football enthusiast through and through. Joey Galloway said ridiculous things yesterday on the college football playoff show that Indiana should consider resting Curtis Rourke for this game. I'm not even going to encourage that kind of behavior. But when you look at the overall landscape of what the college football playoff committee has in front of them, Indiana, forget winning this game outright. They win. We know they're going to be included. In your estimation, what do the Hoosiers have to prove in Columbus? Is it losing by 14 points or less? Is it just avoiding a blowout to have all of their hard work through the first 10 games not go completely to waste and allow them to get a seat at the table, assuming they win the regular season finale against Purdue for the Old Oaken Bucket?
Yeah, I think even 14 points is going to depend. Is it a late Ohio State touchdown? Is it, some garbage stuff for Indiana to get it to 14? It's people forget this is a TV show, and Indiana's not the type of brand that draws people, so they are looking for any way, shape, or form to not have an Indiana in the playoffs. So it would be in Indiana's best interest, let's just say, to cover this number.
Interesting sideline stories to all of these games unfolding here, and the Hoosiers will meet their first test on the road in Columbus against an Ohio State team that, look, we can't sugarcoat that either. Ohio State outright loss, they might find themselves in a little bit of harm's way should they wrap the regular season at 10-2, and that's just assuming a win against Michigan, which we may not know to actually be the case. Big Ten back to the Big 12. BYU on the road in Tempe to take on Arizona State. The Sun Devils, a modest 3-point favorite in this game. Total 54. I wish it was 54. 48.5. Interesting comment this week leading up to the game on Kenny Dillingham, mentioning that there are a lot of similarities in terms of what BYU does from an offensive scheme standpoint to the way Arizona State has more or less modeled himself under transfer quarterback Sam Leavitt. BYU, they control their own destiny to reach the Big 12 championship game at Arizona State and Houston to close the season. We mentioned their loss to Kansas at home last week to 17-13. Conservative estimates, though, have BYU's fans already gobbling up a nice amount of tickets, much to Kenny Dillingham's chagrin, saying that Arizona State fans need to try and more or less protect the Valley and keep BYU fans from infiltrating the stadium. Arizona State, look, we had questions last week when we broke down the game against Kansas State, and they went out there and exceeded odds makers' expectations. Dominant effort from the Sun Devils, winning 24-14. They led the game 24-0 with 11 minutes to go in the third quarter, kind of before they shut it all down. And this team has kind of embraced that disrespect role going into that game. We'll see if they can carry that forward. What was interesting is BYU players more or less admitting before they played Kansas that they weren't prepared for the game. Not sure if that's good or bad, knowing everything that was at stake when you're one of a handful of undefeated teams that remain. But Brad, last week, offensively, BYU did a lot of things moving the football between the 20s. They consistently bogged down in the red zone. Problem from Jake Retzlaff getting picked at the end of the half, which changed some of that momentum. And BYU, they want to run the football. I mean, L.J. Martin continues to be the bell cow back. Hinckley Ropati gives them at least a change of pace guy. But Arizona State defensively, one of the bigger surprises, not just as the entire program, but the way that this group seems to be more about the sum of its parts than any individual contributor. And every time you kind of want to write them off, they go out there, put together a buttoned-up effort, a nice bounce-back performance against Kansas State's offense after giving up 30-plus to UCF and being pretty fortunate to come away with the home win against the Knights more than a few weeks ago.
I don't see a massive edge here. It's a very interesting matchup, but statistically, there's not many. The one unit doesn't have a massive edge over the other when breaking this down. I mean, BYU's offense up fine, solid. I mean, above average certainly. Yards per play 49th. 37th in EPA, 51st in success rate. They're not going to wow you. Any individual unit or individual player, Retzlaff has been efficient, but not certainly, is not the type of quarterback that I would want, to absolutely need him to win me a football game, and didn't take care of the football in some instances. And you mentioned the trouble in the red zone last week. I mean, thankfully for us, the 4 trips, 6 points.
I'm not apologizing for a win, Brad.
No,
not apologizing for a win.
I will say you mentioned I thought it was unbelievable how candid some of the players were in the media. Roberts said they had struggled all week in practice in the red zone. And he's like, well, it just carried over. So it was kind of refreshing to get some candid comments. But why did they struggle? Well, I would say when you're unbeaten, there's a little bit more pressure. You're a little tighter. Windows get tighter a little bit. Offensive line has struggled a little bit in recent games. First 7 games only allowed 6 sacks. Last 3, 8 sacks. You look at the lack of success on 3rd and 4th down. I think some of that's going to rest on who ultimately comes out ahead of this matchup. Is BYU struggles on 3rd and 4th down. The success rate, number 97th. Arizona State, though, struggles on defense in that category, only 87th. So I'm not over, LG Martin's a fine running back. Chase Roberts and Lassiter are fine. If I need them to go win me a football game on the road in a hostile environment, I don't have a high trust factor. With Arizona State, I thought you broke it down great on that side of the ball. I'm a big guy. I'm looking at individual players, highlighting them. Oh, that guy looks impressive. Who is that guy? I didn't know him coming into the season. I don't have a lot of circles or highlights on Arizona State's defense, but what I am impressed is, the production, certainly a lot better than I expected. I mean, when you're 36th in yards per play, you're number 23 in EPA. It's certainly the sum is greater than the parts when it comes to them. Last 4 games, run defense has given up a little bit. I know last week only allowed 14 points, but they did allow a season-high 412 yards. I know Kansas State was chasing, but I got to tell you, if Kansas State would have had a little bit better quarterback, that game might have got dicey last week. They probably shut it down on offense a little too early. The pass rush hasn't been there. Number 133 in the country. Last I checked, that's second to last in pass rush grade. So, if you need to force a turnover in a key moment, we'll see if they have anybody here. If I'm meandering a little bit, it's just because it's one of the first times this year that I don't see a significant edge. I think they're both better than expected. They're both above average. They're both try-hard units. Sum's greater than the parts. Probably a solid matchup. I don't see a solid edge here. I'm not surprised that the number's 3 because probably even on the other side of the ball, it's going to be close to even. So, it's the old basic handicapping 101. Both teams look even, give 3 points home field advantage. We got a line of 3.
It's such an interesting game because you always wonder with a team like BYU that has their bubble burst last week, does some of that linger and carry over, but very much everything is still in front of them in terms of being in control of their own destiny. And we know with the new format, win the Big 12, it doesn't matter. If you have that one blemish on your resume, you can still punch your ticket to the postseason. But Payne on the other side, Arizona State, look, they've surprised a lot of people, and I don't think anybody anticipated that the Sun Devils would have the record that they do at this juncture of the season. And a big reason for that is what they've gotten on the offensive side from their de facto triplets. Sam Leavitt, the first Arizona State quarterback with 3+ passing touchdowns and no interceptions in 3 consecutive games since a man who won the Heisman Trophy in Jaden Daniels back in 2019. Cam Scatabo, averaging just shy of 170 scrimmage yards per game this season, 3rd in the FBS. Returned from that 1-game injury absence, took on a full workload against Kansas State, and while he wasn't overly efficient, 73 yards on the ground, 44 through the air, and arguably the guy that doesn't get enough buzz what he means to the passing game, Jordan Tyson, being an absolute matchup nightmare. Arizona State doesn't have much in the passing game, and teams still can't slow down Tyson. 12 catches, 176 yards, and a pair of touchdowns against Kansas State. But BYU defensively, the metrics don't stand out to you, but you watch this defense, and in my opinion, they're better than what the numbers suggest. Curious to get your take on what we expect from Kenny D's offense against Kalani Sitake's defense, knowing that coaching fingerprints are all over these 2 units more so than the other side of the ball.
I'm in line with Brad, and it's terrible because we've kind of beat a dead horse about the 2024 college football season being wide open and chaotic, and there not being a ton of consistency week to week from teams. And if you go back to last week, part of our handicap was like, it'll be interesting to see how BYU handles this spot in this situation with expectations of not just a Big 12 championship, but, joining the first ever 12-team college football playoff. And we saw them tight. And I thought that was a breath of fresh air to your guys' points that a lot of players came out and said, wasn't good enough during the week. I think we do see a better effort. What's interesting, though, for the specific side of my matchup is like the season-long data suggests Arizona State's offense should be able to bully BYU in the trench. Right? Arizona State's offensive line, top 20 in line yards created. Cam Scatterbu, as we know, is the engine to the offense. He's been wildly efficient. He's forced a missed tackle on more than 33% of his runs. And because of that, Arizona State's top 10 in rushing success rate. The O-line doesn't allow a lot of negatives, and it's obviously tough to bring Cam down behind the line of scrimmage. So I think the Sun Devils, are in a ton of nice late down situations. And if you look at the metrics, it leads to a near 49% late down conversion rate because Kenny D basically has the entire playbook open to him, and that obviously helps a young quarterback like Sam Leavitt. BYU defensively, when you adjust for opponent, had been very vulnerable on the ground, outside the top 70 in defensive line yards allowed and rushing success rate allowed. Where the variance lies is exactly what you pinpointed, Todd, and we were fortunate because part of the handicap last week was also that Kansas would be able to dominate this part of the matchup against BYU, and they did so on the opening drive. And
that opening drive was picture perfect, baby.
Yeah. We're like, this is going to be, they're going to cruise here. And yes, Devin Neal ended up with 2 rushing touchdowns, but he only averaged 3.7 a carry with 1.5 coming before first contact. Jalen Daniels had 9 designed or impromptu runs for 20 yards. After the opening drive, Kansas had less than 50 rushing yards the rest of the game. And so when I look on paper, the Kansas rush advantage last week was larger than Arizona State's this week. And BYU held Kansas to a 24th percentile EPA rush effort. And so I'm saying to myself, if BYU's defense can replicate that effort from last week and force Sam Leavitt to not be comfortable in these advantageous late down situations, this game gets really, really interesting. I'm not quite sure where this goes, where the price settles. We've felt BYU has been overrated for a large stretch this season. We have been fading BYU multiple times. Arizona State closed a 2.5-point home favorite against UCF with a 3-star freshman quarterback making his first road start. Luck boxed their way to a 4-point win with a blocked punt for a touchdown and a pick six. And so to me, you're paying a little bit of a premium at 3.5 to back Arizona State in this spot. Does it mean they can't overcome it? No, it just felt a touch pricey at 3.5, and I ultimately think this game will be won with a battle. I'm interested to see potentially what comes in here later in the week because some groups that I respect, one's already kind of put out a buy on BYU and another one's looking for a buy in Arizona State. So doesn't help our listeners. It's a conversation that we've had a lot this season. But there are battles all over the place right now, and this is one of those games.
A fun game to both the points that you guys made on opposite sides of the ball, trying to figure out where one team may have a decided advantage, but the market is the ultimate equalizer, an indicator, however you want to articulate that. And to your point, Payne, I mean, we've gone against BYU each of the last 2 weeks, thought there was some opportunity in the market, would not have that same sentiment right now with Arizona State installed as a field goal favorite in this matchup. So next move will be interesting. Do we get back to 3.5? Do we come off of the key of 3 and tick a little bit further south into that 2.5 range? Gentlemen, the final marquee game on the big board this week takes us to Yankee Stadium, where it's Army taking on the Fighting Irish, and for those scoring at home, this does count as a Notre Dame home game, so they will control the ticket allotment, something that was not lost on Todd Monken, saying anyone who thinks it's going to be a split crowd is only fooling themselves despite the proximity to Army's campus, a prominent alumni base out there for the Fighting Irish. Both teams ranked in the AP poll entering a meeting against one another for the first time since 1958. The Irish have won 15 straight meetings since their last loss back in 1958, where I didn't have the videotape. I didn't go back and watch, but it clearly wasn't a game that over-bettors were thrilled with Army winning that game 14-2. Teams are combined 18-1 this season, the best combined record entering a head-to-head matchup since 1946. Army, longest active winning streak in the FBS, 13 games, already has clinched a spot in the American Athletic Conference title game with Tulane's victory last week against Navy. They've trailed for a grand total of 5 minutes and 48 seconds so far this season, the fewest of any team in the FBS. Notre Dame, since their loss to NIU, they've outscored their opponents by more than 32 points per game during the streak. It's the best points per game differential over any 8-game span for the Fighting Irish, going back to the Joe Montana days in 1977. Last week, final score a little bit misleading. The Irish built a 35-0 lead against Virginia. Somehow the game ends 35-14, with the Irish not showing the killer instinct to get the cover across the finish line. Brad, Army offensively. Look, we had North Texas and quite large against Army a couple of weeks ago, working under the expectation that Bryson Daly wasn't going to play. He went out there, played, but didn't exactly lead Army to a gaudy offensive output at just 14 points. But this is a program that does a great job of protecting the football. They love to play keep away. They lead the FBS in rushing yards per game and rushing touchdowns per game. But clearly, when you go through their schedule, we talked a little bit about strength of schedule for Indiana. Army ain't seen the kind of dudes on the defensive side they're going to see with the guys wearing Shamrock Series jerseys and those iconic gold helmets.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable. And we're talking about a marquee game, and you look at Army's schedule, have not faced a single team in the top 90 of my power ratings. I mean, indulge me a little bit here, but let's start with Lehigh. If you threw them into the FBS rankings, number 133, FAU 124, Rice 96, Temple 123, Tulsa 127, UAB 125, East Carolina 92, Air Force 111, North Texas 94. That's the power rating of their opponents so far this season. Notre Dame, 4 touchdowns better than any team they faced as far as just a power rating. And I know that a lot of the statistical numbers look great for Army for who they played. You look at their number 1 in rush success rate. Bryson Daly, number 8 in QBR. PFF has the Army offense as the highest graded offense in the country, obviously not factoring an opponent there, but you can only play, once the schedule's set, you can only control how you play, not who you play. They played well at least the first 7 games of the season. I would say by far their worst 2 performances came in their last 2 games against Air Force, obviously with Daly out, and you're facing an Air Force defense that knows how to defend the option. But then the North Texas data point. You're right. We were on North Texas as large as almost any position this season. Daly plays. And obviously you think, well, he's not 100%. That's why they struggled. No, Daly ran it 36 times and had to run it 36 times in that game. It's just, he couldn't throw 15 yards throwing for him. The offensive line didn't get that push like you would hope against a very bad North Texas defense. I thought North Texas defense individually and the unit played very hard. They played out of their minds in that game and deserved better from the North Texas offense. But boy, this is such a step up for this Army offense. And I would say this, they're certainly more traditional option offense compared to Navy, which Notre Dame's already faced this year. That they're certainly going to lean much more on the run game than what Navy did. It's not only Daly with over 1,000 yards rushing. You got Udo with nearly 1,000 yards. Noah Short's actually, one of the highest graded running back / guys catching the ball out of the backfield in the entire country. He's averaging 23.5 yards per catch, averaging more than 10 yards per carry. He's number 3 in opponent-adjusted EPA in the country. They're really good in run blocking, obviously, number 1 in the country there. Their right tackle, Lucas Scott's probably their best player up front. It's just, obviously Army, the game plan here is to control the clock, get 3-4 yards a pop, convert on 4th downs, get those, that one drive. What did they have? A 15-minute drive against North Texas. I think North Texas only had 6 possessions in the game. Obviously, that's the formula here. The problem is, Notre Dame defensively does not give. I mean, they force teams to be in third and long. Notre Dame's number 1 in the country in early downs EPA. They're number 1 in the country, Notre Dame, in stop rate. That just drives and ends in punts, turnovers, stopped on downs. Michigan, the national champ last year, was number 1 in that stat. Notre Dame's actually slightly higher stop rate than Michigan last year. The run game for Notre Dame defensively showed some weakness early in the season. I was a little bit concerned. Been better as of late. I think if there's some optimism for Army, it would be Howard Cross. Notre Dame's one of their best interior defensive linemen. Questionable. I think he's probably more towards doubtful than questionable here. However, in his absence, I don't know if it's his. He's been having nagging injuries all season. Was in a boot in that game on the sidelines against Florida State. I don't think it's 50-50. If he does play, he's going to be far less than 100%. However, you saw, maybe you weren't watching at that point, Payne. Maybe you shut it off. As soon as he went out,
I didn't start.
As soon as he went,
that's not true, Brad. Payne's lying. I think he watched the first drive because he wanted to see how some of the youth looked, and then promptly flipped the game off.
Yeah. That was about the gist.
Yeah, it felt like. I mean, as soon as he went out of that game 2 games ago, Riley Mills picked up his game, had like 3 sacks almost consecutively. He's got 6 sacks on the season. Donovan Heinisch is a try-hard kid. His older brother played 4 years at Notre Dame, is playing still in the pros for the Texans. I think he's actually more talented than his brother. So, yes, it's a loss, particularly against a rush offense like Army, but I like it's been next man up across the board on this Notre Dame team all season, and the replacements have played well. I think another advantage here is Notre Dame's got some. Not only Al Golden's seen the option a bunch, Marcus Freeman's seen the option a bunch, even back to when Monken brought up, when he had to face Marcus Freeman when he was at Cincinnati. So, I mean, you got coaches and players that have seen the option multiple times. I mean, Jack Kaiser's played 63 games in Notre Dame uniform, more than anybody in history. He's the guy that's in charge with a lot of the defensive play calls in the middle. This is the best pass defense in the country, in my opinion. They'll walk up their safeties. They're not going to be tested. Xavier Watts will be closer to the line. I don't see a great pathway here. Certainly, if they can force a couple of Notre Dame turnovers on offense, they can keep the drives moving. Certainly, they can stay in the number. I think there's going to be a battle in the marketplace because you're going to see, Army's stats saying and style of play with both teams running slow tempo. How can you lay double digits here? But I am sky is falling Chicken Little Notre Dame fan. I have not been, and you probably noticed this the last month. There's a lot of things I like what I see from this team. So I am actually on the Notre Dame side of this one. I have bet Notre Dame. I like Notre Dame. Even, hey, it's a terrible number across a key number of 14. I would still be more inclined to lay it here.
What you're saying is on 3rd and 6 and 3rd and 8, Notre Dame's corners won't be playing 12 yards off the receiver like North Texas was, and you watch their head coach go into a tizzy when they convert those 3rd and longs?
You will not see that.
Payne, before we come to you and get your take on the Irish offense and how they match up against the Army defense, Brad, one final question I have for you. In terms of assessing this game from a number standpoint, the way Army is currently constructed coming off of the bye versus where Navy was at the point in the season where the Irish ended up drawing them, comparable from a power rating standpoint? I mean, it's hard to look at Navy now and for people that watch them get blown out by Tulane, but at least coming into that Notre Dame game versus where Army is now.
Yeah, good question. I have Army higher than Navy at this point compared to where Navy was. I had a huge overlay in that game, as big as any all season. Turned out to be right because Navy turned the football over. But I got an overlay here. I'm kind of similar as far as power rating and that heading into the Navy game, power rating on this matchup. Notre Dame, I'm close to that Notre Dame 17 range.
It's always interesting when you look at games like this and you try and identify exactly where some of these teams are. And how the market has trouble kind of contextualizing, especially for a team that wants to take the air out of the ball. Payne, if Notre Dame is going to win and do so comfortably. What does the path to victory look like for a team that wants to run the football against an Army defense that, look, we can go through all the numbers. We can look at some of the underlying metrics, but this is going to be a different beast than what they've encountered so far. North Texas, arguably the most dynamic offense they face, but North Texas doesn't have the same bodies in the trenches and an ability to run the football at the same proficient clip that we should see from Notre Dame here on Saturday night.
I think the question you asked Brad at the end there was obviously better than the Joey Galloway question. But the reason we are having a little bit of a battle here. Go ahead.
I would say Brad's smarter and more buttoned up when it comes to college football than Joey Galloway. So,
yeah, just doesn't have the speed downfield.
Maybe at this point in his life, Brad might have a step on Joey.
If I have a bike.
We've kind of seen the market, right? Army money comes in at 17. It even showed at 15.5 yesterday after that move on Notre Dame came in at 14. There was some conversation, I think, where maybe some patience should have been exhibited there, where we might have gotten a 13.5.
Yes.
Just kind of from what I had been hearing. Army is off the bye, which allows Bryson Daly to maybe even get healthier if you had that question mark. But I thought Brad was astute and pointed out that, he ran it 37 times against North Texas. I think if you're looking at Notre Dame Navy, and here's kind of my problem is, and thinking that this is a repeat, maybe you're right. I just don't think Army turns it over 6 times. I think Bryson Daly
that's a bold statement, Payne.
Yeah, I don't think Bryson Daly, to me, Daly's going to be far healthier than Horvath attempting to play with a significant thumb injury and literally dropping the ball at the goal line. But the key to Notre Dame covering 14.5 now, which is current market, is twofold, right? Notre Dame, to your point, has to be able to run the ball well enough to force Army to sell out and put guys in the box, right? Notre Dame's offensive line actually doesn't get the push you would think outside the top 60 in offensive line yards. They've gone through injuries and youth movements up front. They do allow defensive lines to penetrate. Army's defensive line isn't built that way. It's more about being gap sound than penetrating. They don't create a ton of negatives. The system is designed to keep things in front. On paper, Army has a better defensive front than Navy, even if you adjust for schedule. So, if Army can do a decent enough job to force Riley Leonard into making decisions and being accurate and not allowing the easy read one-on-one looks where corners are trailing Notre Dame receivers by 3-4 yards like they were against Navy, Army will have a shot. We thought against Navy, Riley Leonard would find downfield success despite Notre Dame having one of the worst explosive passing offenses in the country. He did. Riley was 7 for 10 on throws, 10-plus yards down the field with 2 touchdowns. And you're seeing, because Navy had to sell out, their corners on an island, and it's like Notre Dame receivers are 3-4 yards wide open on these crossers. Where Riley struggles is in these known passing situations. Outside the top 70 in passing down success rate, outside the top 70 in late down success rate. Just last week against Virginia, Notre Dame was the right side. We understand the 4th and goal situation. We understand the missed field goal and then Virginia scoring at the buzzer. Those would have never been things that were allowed to transpire had Notre Dame not been 1 for 10 when they faced 3rd and 5 or more. When you ask Riley Leonard to be a drop-back passer behind 2 backup tackles and I would say serviceable receiver group, Notre Dame's offense just looks different than when they're living on standard downs and dictating. And so maybe that's a feather to put in the cap as we maybe move to playoff talk down the line. But in this spot, the entire key is, again, Army being decent enough stopping the run to where they don't have to allocate 8 in the box to stop Jeremiah Love and Price and Leonard's legs and force Leonard to have some tougher passing situations. If that doesn't happen, then Notre Dame can find some explosiveness through the air that they don't typically have, and that's the key you're looking for when you need to cover 2-3 scores, easy explosives, and to me, that's the entire key in this game.
Yeah, and a little bit of under money coming in from where this total opened at 45 down to 44.5. You do wonder about the level of correlation. It almost feels like it's favored to the under, meaning Army doesn't do its fair share of scoring where the game goes over if the dog is live, because I'm not sure Army is going to be okay scoring just 7 points to get this thing across the finish line. if the Black Knights are able to end up getting a cover. But a great game.
And this is like very much the conversation we had with Notre Dame Navy. I know we were on the Notre Dame side of things, but you had different factions who command market respect. One faction saying, hey, we made the game 11.5. Another faction saying, we made the game 21. And so I think the reason, again, we're going to have a battle is because of that mindset. I can see both those groups, again, having different mindsets. Do we get below 14 again?
No, I do think we might see 14 again. I echo your
Okay.
sentiments that the patience should have been required more there, that we could have possibly seen a 13.5.
Okay.
That's what I was waiting on. But I, again, think 14 is still good to go here. But I will say, like you mentioned, I certainly think there's less variance than the Navy game. I do not anticipate. I expect Army to be a little bit more buttoned up. Todd, I'm glad you brought up the home field, the ticket allotment, because, man, did Monken go on almost a rant on that. I mean, he spent several minutes on it.
Incredible.
So where do I get to that? Well, probably if the crowd's going to be 75, 80, or maybe even 90% Notre Dame, maybe you should put maybe a half point there. Maybe that's worth and when you're talking a low total, every half point matters. So maybe that's not getting totally factored in right now.
And it's an area in New York City where there are plenty of Notre Dame alums. It's not like they're playing this in the middle of the wilderness. This is a game I'm sure a lot of folks with ties to the university have had circled on the calendar. It's not by coincidence that they play these Shamrock Series games in some of these cities that are handpicked before the season starts.
Aside from Bryson Daly getting healthier in this bye, and I'm going to put you guys on the spot here because there isn't a defined answer, and maybe you have the data, Brad. Army later in the season with buys, and this comes to mind because Monken was talking about how his teams start to die down the stretch because of all the other commitments they have being in the Army. Do we think the bye helps them dramatically more than some other teams potentially?
Good question. I don't have the data behind that to say.
Yeah.
They did finish strong last year.
Todd, I know you and I had talked about this. We were reading his quotes like 2 weeks ago, and they're like, these guys are basically dead right now. Because, they still have their other commitments, waking up at 5 a.m. and doing X, Y, and Z. And we've kind of seen some lethargicness out of them the last 2 weeks maybe that bye week is a little bit more helpful than we think.
These dudes ain't logging 12 hours of sleep with some of their academic and commitments and everything else that comes along with it. So you imagine the late bye pays dividends here. But to your point, Payne, I think the other thing is that we're seeing now in college football, we never had two byes during the regular season. So some of the data points this late in the year, it'll be interesting to see going forward and how some of these teams benefit and coaches that are a little bit more buttoned up in terms of being able to devise game plans. So a number of interesting subplots and storylines, but clearly the marquee game Saturday night between two programs with proud traditions and expectations to try and be able to make a little bit more noise in terms of the national landscape before the season is over. I know a lot of our loyal listeners, gentlemen, are listening going, wait a second, you guys have kind of run through the board. We see where Notre Dame and Notre Dame and Army is listed in terms of the rotation. What's going on here? We haven't gotten to the non-Powers 5 game, but this week, a little bit of a unique occurrence, unilateral agreement across all factions. So BP, the floor is yours for where we're going with the little guy to get us to the window.
Yeah, let me start by saying that obviously for 2 years was pretty good in this section on the group of 5 non-Powers 5 best bet. This year, not so much. I can bitch about market timing and all this stuff and stuff not lining up. A lot of it, probably you can tell in the picks some more totals than usual. Last week, a big favorite, even though the market agreed and moved to 6.5 points after I recorded this podcast. 7. and still
21, yeah.
And still was not the right side at any point in that game. Knew you were dead almost immediately. This one, and I'm bringing all this up because this one feels more in the wheelhouse of the last couple of years. This is the type of stuff that felt like I was giving out on a weekly basis the last couple of years, and thankfully it timed up right at this week. And we're going to game number. I'll give the game number because it's 211 UL Monroe. We're going UL Monroe +3 here. So what am I seeing? Number one, let's talk statistically. ULM is the much better team statistically. You look at yards per play margin. That one of the old school wise guy stat that's very basic, but still pretty pertinent. They're 1 yard per play better on average, their margin, than Arkansas State, despite playing a tougher schedule than Arkansas State. I also look at speaking of schedule, ULM's taken a step down in class. They've lost 4 straight. South Alabama, Marshall, Texas State, 3 of the better teams in the Sun Belt. Auburn last week. They've only been one bowl game as a program in their entire history. They've been sitting on 5 wins for over a month. This has got to be the circle game, especially with a tough Sun Belt opponent on deck. Talking about bowl games, Arkansas State's probably fat and happy. They just clinched bowl eligibility last week. But to me, I think Arkansas State's a very phony team. 5-0 record in one-possession games. Despite a 6-4 overall record, they've been outscored by nearly double digits on a per-game basis, outgained by 72 yards per game. I think ULM, underrated team, better team statistically, need it more against a team that's fat and happy. We'll take the +3, more than happy to take that, but I think this, to me, screams like an outright win here for Monroe.
And I would echo a lot of those same sentiments. Go ahead, Payne.
Todd, I will let you talk, but just as a point of reference to last week for the loyal listeners, this is a neighborhood I drive through, and I do it willingly with the windows down late at night. So this is certainly more my speed as well, and it's one that we had talked about for a couple days. And when I saw Brad send it across, I was like, "Yep, that's the one." So 211 UL Monroe +3. There is straggling 3.5 out there if you can get it. But any further thoughts from your perspective?
No,
Todd?
It was kind of exactly the way Brad articulated. As you go through Monroe's schedule, this is a program that hasn't experienced a lot of success overall, and getting that elusive Sticks win would be massive. You look at what Monroe has with their 2 remaining games. I know going on the road to Jonesboro won't be easy by any stretch, but a home date against Louisiana in the regular season finale, probably not where you want to pin your hopes to get bowl eligible. And as far as Monroe, look, the teams that they have played in this class earlier this season, wins against Jackson State, UAB, Troy, James Madison, and Southern Miss, that's where Arkansas State lives and breathes. Meanwhile, Monroe's losses, Texas, Auburn, South Alabama, Marshall, and Texas State, teams that are in that upper echelon in the Sun Belt. This sets up perfectly for an all-in effort for a Monroe team to be able to get right after losing by 34 points last week against Auburn. So I think Brad has not stumbled on, but identified, zeroed in, and hit the bullseye with this particular target, with Monroe as an underdog. And much like he said, take the points. It's a great idea. I'm not sure we're going to need him. I think Monroe wins the game outright.
Non-powers 5 and the best bet converge. Let's get UL Monroe home.
Let's do it, boys. Let's see what we got. Anything else that you guys would like to share with our loyal listeners before we bid them a fond farewell and a schedule update for next week with the holiday? Things will look a little bit different, so make sure you're subscribed to the Bet the Board podcast feeds. We're going to wrap everything into one in a unique format for college football and the NFL. The goal will be to have that for people's commutes. What do we decide? Wednesday, Payne, that would go live, or late Tuesday night?
Yeah, we'll figure it out. We'll send it out on the old social channel at Bet the Board Pod, and maybe include the schedule in the newsletter as well.
Perfect. We will do all that. So I want to thank all of you guys and girls for tuning in. It has been a marathon, not a sprint. The college season, the regular season winds down with Thanksgiving weekend, the final Saturday of the season before we get into those postseason games, and we'll be with you every step of the way until they crown a national champion. So for Brad Powers, Payne Insider, I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your college football Week 13 investments, but most importantly, with a UL Monroe Warhawks ticket in that portfolio. We'll see you at the
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.